So today's topic is China's India War 1962. The year of 1962 began very well for Jawaharlal Nehru. He was, in fact, the monarch, the democratic monarch of all he surveyed. The second 5-year plan was a grand success. India was carefully building its institutions. The Goa operation of December 1961 was also a good military victory over Portugal. Though the Western powers were complaining, they knew inwardly that India's stand was right. In the general elections, Congress won a victory, yet another victory, bagging 361 seats, I think. The election of Krishnan from Bombay was in fact spoken about during those days. He won a resounding victory against J.P. Kripalani, a old veteran of the Congress. But at the end of the year, Jawaharlal Nehru was just a shade of his old self. Galbraith, the American ambassador to India, who had seen Nehru in his salad days, was shocked by his appearance. Nehru looked shrunk and tired. Galbraith, in fact, sent a photo of Jawaharlal Nehru to JFK Kennedy to prove his point. Nehru was confident A Krishnan, who won a victory in May 1962, was booted out of the cabinet. General Thapa, who was the chief of the army staff, sent in his resignation. B.M. Kaul, the darling of Jawaharlal Nehru, Jawaharlal Nehru's detractors used to say, was sulking. Nehru himself was still the prime minister, but only because of his enormous prestige. The greatest setback Nehru felt was, of course, what he thought was the betrayal of the Chinese. He was, for the last 11 years, pleading the cause of the People's Republic of China in all international fora. And he thought his reward was the invasion of India and the humiliating defeat of the Indian army. Nehru never really recovered. He plodded on until death came to him in May 1964. In fact, 1964 was a watershed year in the history of modern India. Its effects are still being felt by us. Even in 1962, Nehru baiters were many, and they felt that he got what was coming to him because of his own foolishness. His supporters thought that he was cruelly betrayed by China, whom he considered a friend. Today also the same position remains. In fact, in the history of the world, events such as the War of 1962 were not very common. On the other hand, they were exceedingly rare, I must say. Only a few years ago, Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai was rending the air in India. Overnight, China had become a deadly enemy, a rat-eating monster who could never be trusted. The paranoia was such that many persons of Chinese descent were rounded up and held in camps, their lives utterly ruined. India became xenophobic within a period of months. With this introduction, I propose to start my speech. I have divided into 5 parts: the genesis, the army, the diplomatic efforts from 1949 and 1962, the war and its immediate aftermath. The cause of 1962 war can be explained in 2 words. One is Tibet, the other is Aksai. See, not many of us know, but Tibet is unique in this world as a mass provider of fresh water through rivers. Rivers like Yangtze, Yellow River, Brahmaputra and several others, to China, India and a dozen other nations downstream. Tibet is a source of major headwaters for the rivers of Asia and additionally provides key tributaries or feeders for other rivers such as the Ganges. There is no parallel to this situation anywhere else on the planet. We must remember this. China understood the importance of Tibet very early and had laid claim to the plateau, Tibetan plateau. Even though India had very close ties with Tibet, India, independent India that is, did not have the military means to establish its control over Tibet. Communist China, on the other hand, had the means and did establish its control over Tibet quickly. Aksai Chin, a western slice of Ladakh, gained strategic importance later. In fact, if you analyze the history of Tibet, Tibet in 19th century was a nation of great intrigue. Four of his lamas, in fact, the 9th, 10th, 11th and 12th, I think, they all died very young under mysterious circumstances. The 13th lived only for 57 years. The present Lama, of course, is the Dalai Lama. Okay, thankfully he is alive. He is the 14th. Tibet in the 20th century was subjected to two invasions. In 1903 and 1904, the British adventurer Young Husband invaded Tibet and occupied Lhasa. China protested, and in 1906, Britain and China entered into a convention which stated that the government of Great Britain engages not to annex Tibetan territory or to interfere in the administration of Tibet. The government of China also undertakes not to permit any other foreign state to interfere with the territory or internal administration of Tibet. This was a hands-off agreement between Britain and China. But in 1910, Tibet invaded Lhasa and deposed the 13th Dalai Lama, who fled to India like his successor did. But the Chinese occupation was brief, and it was during this occupation that the troops of China entered Nifa, that is the present-day Arunachal Pradesh, and occupied Walang, which was at the eastern tip of the present-day Arunachal Pradesh. Of course, with the fall of the Qing dynasty, the Chinese troops had to vacate Tibet. Actually, the British administration did not keep quiet. They wanted to settle once for all the status of Tibet. With this aim in view, it called for a conference in Shimla in the year 1914. This conference was held for 9 months. Okay, the Tibetans, the Chinese and the British were the participants, and a convention was finally signed which stated the following. The British government recognized that Tibet was under the suzerainty of China. This word suzerainty and sovereignty are two much bandied words when it comes to Tibet. You would keep hearing these words again and again. Suzerainty means upper sovereign, and that is the principle of one bigger country holding sway over a smaller country. The smaller country, while not an integral part of the bigger country, depends on the bigger country for all practical purposes. The modern examples, I could say the US control over Puerto Rico, or Denmark's control over Greenland. We must remember that even Hawaii was considered to be under the suzerainty of US in the 19th century. Okay, there's not much of a difference between suzerainty and sovereignty, because for all practical purposes, the smaller country is under the thumb of the bigger country. Okay. The agreement also said that the government of China would not convert Tibet into a province of China. But the most importantly for India, the agreement had a clause. It produced a map. In that map, there was a red line which demarcated the borders between British India and Tibet. This red line was the McMahon line, the famous McMahon line. The McMahon line was first drawn on this map, which was arrived at in the convention between the Tibetans, the British and the Chinese. But there's a twist to this story. The Chinese representatives did not sign the convention, they just initiated the convention. When they went back to China, they were chided, and the Chinese government absolutely refused to ratify the agreement. Thus, the Chinese government from 1914 onwards always claimed that they did not recognize the McMahon line. If this was the case in the eastern side, on the western side things were even murkier. In fact, Ladakh was an independent kingdom inhabited by ethnic Tibetan tribals who practiced the Tibetan version of Buddhism, and they maintained very close relationship with Tibet. But in 1834, I think 1834, the Sikh army under General Zorawar Singh annexed Ladakh. Of course, the Sikh empire did not last long. In 1946, Ladakh was incorporated into Jammu and Kashmir, the new princely state formed under Maharaja Gulab Singh. We spoke about this earlier, the Maharaja Gulab Singh's, kingdom of Jammu and Kashmir. In fact, William Johnson, who was a British surveyor, he was the governor of Ladakh under the Maharaja. And in 1865, he produced a boundary through Aksai Chin that would touch till the Kunlun range, which is the high mountains in the area. This boundary was formally proposed to British India in 1890, 1895 or 96, I don't remember, by the chief British military intelligence in London, the chief of military intelligence in London, General John Ardoch. Subsequently, this line became known as Ardoch-Johnson line. That is, the surveyor submitted the line to the intelligence chief and their names were given to this line, which was proposed by this surveyor, British surveyor. The irony, we should keep in mind, the irony is, if Kashmir had not been acceded to India, the Aksai Chin problem would not have arisen at all. Since Aksai Chin was the main bone of contention between India and China, even the war of 1962 might not have happened. These are the ironies of history. The Chinese, of course, did not recognize the Ardoch-Johnson line. But there's also another twist in the story. In 1892, one of their patrols erected some border markers at the Karakoram Pass, where there was an ancient caravan route between Xinjiang and Ladakh. Since then, the Chinese have continued to claim that a greater part of Ladakh's Aksai Chin should be inside the territory claimed by him. The British, of course, did not pay much attention to Chinese moves in this remote and inhospitable area, and in order to create yet another buffer zone between the expanding Russian Empire and Tibet, a new boundary was drawn in 1893. That is, the Johnson boundary was there, this was another boundary. This became known as Macartney-MacDonald line, and this boundary, drawn by the British, placed most of Aksai Chin on the Chinese side of the boundary. Okay, so our claim has always been the Ardoch-Johnson line is the real boundary. So there is a confusion. See, in fact, the Ladakh boundary was shown on many older colonial maps as undefined. In fact, even after independence, Indian maps too had shown the Ladakh boundary as undefined. And if I am not wrong, it was Nehru who asked this map to be corrected. So, at the time of independence, the task of our country and our leaders was primarily to preserve India unified and keep it as a democracy. The border issues all came later. Okay. Nehru and Patel set about curbing the power of the military, and they wanted to ensure, I think this I spoke even earlier, but I want to say this, I want to rub this again, I want to say this again. They wanted to ensure that the military would strictly be under the control of civilian power. Nehru in fact removed the Commander-in-Chief, the CNC, from the table of political decision making. In fact, most Indian officers did not have any experience in higher command functions, and most of them were pro-British and conservative. In fact, the famous generals like Cariappa held as late as 1969-70 that voting should be restricted only to the educated. He had also said that political parties should be disbanded and president rule should be imposed upon the country until law and order was restored. Remember, he was also the one who hailed the 1958 military coup in Pakistan when Ayub Khan took over. There were several retired officers who held similar views. Hence, in the early days of independence, the political leaders were very, very cautious and they took every step to keep India away from a possible military coup. This is very real. It might look absurd now, but at that time it was very real. In fact, in the formative years, the Defense Secretary was H.M. Patel, H.M. Patel ICS, who was a devotee of Sardar Patel, and his successor was M.K. Vellodi, who was also a very strong civil servant. They both ensured that civilian supremacy is well entrenched in the circle of defense. Defense Ministry always had strong civil servants at the secretary level, but it had weak ministers, of course, until Krishnan came along. India also had to depend on foreign experts in the initial years of independence to determine how to shape the armed forces. So thus Nehru consulted two experts. One was Field Marshal Akinlek, who was the Commander-in-Chief of India. Other was the scientist PMS Blackett. Akinlek made a defense plan in the initial years of independence, which envisaged an army of the size of about 200,000 backed by reserve and territorial forces. It was the decision of the then Indian government to retain most of what the Field Marshal suggested. Nehru then asked Blackett to advise him on how India could leverage science for defense. Blackett was no ordinary scientist. He was right at the center of Allied war effort during the Second World War. The US gave him the Medal of Honor for his service during the war, and in 1948 he won the Nobel Prize for Physics. Blackett's 1948 report recommended that India limit its military ambitions and pursue a policy of non-alignment with both superpowers to escape a potentially debilitating arms race. He proposed that military spending should not exceed 2% of the Indian GDP. Till today, the government maintains that India's military spending doesn't exceed 2% of the Indian GDP. This was suggested by Blackett as early as 1948 or 49. Nehru too said in the parliament that army would have only 1.5 lakh men, but highly mobile and heavily armed. But we must ask the question, was the Indian army really prepared to face China in the event of a war? In fact, until the so-called Longju incident in 1959, where Indian soldiers were killed, India's frontiers with China were continued to be manned by civilian border police and the Assam Rifles. The army headquarters maintained that the army should not be committed for day-to-day border security. Of course, it said however a situation arises on a particular border which a civilian border police cannot cope with, the army should assume overall responsibility. In fact, General Timaya, he was a very shrewd general. He was acutely aware of the threat which China could pose. But he also thought that India could never meet a major military change from China. Timaya continued to hold this view even after his retirement. In fact, in July 1962, a few months before the war, he wrote, "I cannot, even as a soldier, envisage India taking on China in an open conflict on its own. It must be left to the politicians and diplomats to ensure our security." Earlier he said, a few years ago he said, China's present strength in manpower, equipment, aircraft exceeds our resources 100-fold with the full support of the USSR, and we could never hope to match China in the foreseeable future. This was General Timaya. Kariyappa too held similar views. I can go on and on, but it's clear that the Indian army never believed in the initial years of independence that it could take on China. Therefore, Nehru perforce had to pursue other options. Interestingly, the army, I think in 1961, they made a sand model exercise on the likely war scenario on the McMahon line. In fact, the army felt three divisions would be required to face the Chinese challenge. In the event of a Chinese attack, the forward brigade should abandon Tawang. You know, Tawang is in Arunachal Pradesh, up north, up northwest, and it should retreat and regroup at Bomdila. Bomdila is in the southern east part of Arunachal Pradesh, And the main defense line would be at Bomdila, and it would be strengthened by light tanks and artillery. So even in 1961, the army was not prepared to face the Chinese forces at the border. This you must keep in mind. The army knew its strength, the army knew its weaknesses. When Krishnan became the defense minister in 1956, it was headed by General Timaya. Before Menon, the defense ministry was headed by non-entities like Baldev Singh, Kadju, and who is the other name? Gopal Samy Iyengar. Menon, it was thought, would transform the ministry. He was the darling of Jawaharlal Nehru. He was a go-getter. The general too was a darling of Nehru. And it was expected that Menon and Timaya would head well. What happened was, within 2 years, they were at each other's throats. It must be said here that Timaya in fact superseded two senior and very accomplished Sikh lieutenant generals to become the chief of the army staff. In fact, it was an open secret at that time that the Punjabi and the Sikh officers resented that they were being commanded by South Indian officers. A CIA report of that period says that 6 persons were sentenced to death for conspiring to kill General Cariappa. This, I don't know how far it is true, but this was a CIA report of that period. Okay. In fact, the first Sikh officer to become the chief of the army staff was General J.J. Singh as late as 2005, almost 60 years after independence. So everyone knew that army was a den of camps and den of intrigue. During Timaya's time, Timaya and Thorat was in one camp, and Thapar, LPs and Bogisen, and General Kaul, they were in the other camp. It was this camp that was close to Menon. You see the irony. Menon was a South Indian, but the Timaya, of course, he was from South India. Thorat was from Maharashtra, almost. It's also South India, okay. Or it's not North India anyway. But they were against, they were not close to Menon. Only these Punjabi officers and Bengali officer and Kashmiri officer, no, they were close to Menon. In fact, Timaya, he actively promoted Thorat's elevation as the chief. Thapar was senior to Thorat, so Thapar bitterly resented this. When before Thapar became the CO, the chief of the army staff, a drama happened. Timaya directly recommended Thorat's name to the president, Rajendra Prasad. So when the file suggesting the promotion of Thapar came to him, he wanted the government to consider Thorat. If I am not mistaken, he sent the file back twice. But the government put his foot down and Thapar became the chief. So there are many such stories, but most of the stories are based on rumors in the officers' mess and after dinner talks, and not much reliance could be placed on them. They are quite interesting, stories. But the major incident which was true was the resignation of Timaya in 1959. In late August 1959, the Indian newspapers leaked a story. In fact, Statesman, I think, leaked the story first, and others took it up later. Story said General Timaya had resigned, but the resignation was almost immediately withdrawn after the general had a talk with the Prime Minister, and the and that news also came in the newspapers. What prompted the general to resign and later withdraw his resignation remains a mystery until now. There are, of course, two versions of the story. One is that Timaya was angry because Nehru announced unilaterally without consulting the army that the Assam Rifles will function under the army. The other story is that Timaya wanted a meeting between Ayub Khan and Nehru, and Krishnan did not like a general meddling with political issues. That Krishnan chided the general and used harsh words appears to be true. But though abrasive, Menon was right in that the general should not have bypassed the defense minister and spoken directly to the prime minister. Nehru too later agreed with this view. To be fair to both the general and Menon, both did not speak a word about what had happened and carried the secret to their graves. That the general was a very proud person might be true, but it is also true that he swallowed his pride and served as the chief until his retirement. But what was not generally known is this. You see, this shows Nehru's personality. Timaya was very close to Nehru and the two shared a warm, easy friendship. In 1954, when Timaya's sister was widowed at a young age with 4 small children, Nehru put her to work in his secretariat, and thereafter she worked with Indira Gandhi for almost 2 decades. This was Jawaharlal Nehru for you. In fact, New York Times said in August 29, 1959, the New York Times says this. It has been said of General Timmy that he likes polo, he likes shooting, he likes ballroom dancing, he likes military history, and he likes Prime Minister Nehru. So this was the relationship between Nehru and General Timaya. The other interesting story is the source of the leak. Later it was found out was General Chaudhary, who was later the chief of the army staff. He himself had admitted later that he was the unofficial military correspondent of the newspaper Statesman. This was how things were during those days. But in this entire episode, there is no doubt that Menon acted in a very immature manner during the tenure of Timaya. He actively promoted Thapar and he actively created, the evidence suggests that he actively created various groups in the army. If you ask me the question, did Nehru behave immaturely in the Timaya episode? My answer would be yes. Because his habit of hobnobbing with military personnel encouraged cronyism. Nehru should have kept aloof from military personnel, which he didn't do. Okay, he had some reasons, but overall he was wrong. He should have kept them away. He was after all the prime minister. To be fair to Menon, and contrary to the public image, Menon in fact wanted Indian defense to flower, to develop. He was the father of all our defense installations. The defense manufacturing units all over India. Before he became defense minister, he was one of very few leaders, which many people don't say this. He was one of very few leaders who actively promoted a substantial increase in defense expenditure. It was the finance minister who was the stumbling block. The other interesting thing is not that Nehru completely took the line taken by Krishnan Menon. Okay. The case of the increasing US influence, Nehru did not pay heed to the warnings of Krishnan Menon. There are so many stories. In fact, Krishnan Menon had been drawing Nehru's attention to the growing influence of the US in Indian public life in the 50s of the last century. But this bonhomie was with the full knowledge of Nehru. But Krishnan Menon kept on, nagging Nehru. Okay. In fact, he was talking about the establishment of, this was perhaps the price India had to pay for its growing dependence on foreign aid, and the establishment of Aid India consortium comprising 13 countries and coordinated by the World Bank. At that time, India also had begun to depend heavily on American wheat offered at attractive terms. US economists mobilized by MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, they started storming India, and they have taken, they have started taking great interest in Indian planning. And Ford Foundation, of course, it was firming up plans to support Indian education and research institutions. There was also some talk of build a partnership in defense. All these things were happening in the 50s of the last century. So the story that India was leaning towards Soviet Union was not true at all. Okay, I will close this Timaya episode by narrating another very interesting. This is not a story. This was something revealed by Malcolm MacDonald, the British High Commissioner to India. This was what he had written to his government, which is available now on record. This is what Malcolm MacDonald, the British High Commissioner to India, says. Let me read that. The general told me that he had bent over backwards to work successfully with Mr. Menon, but the minister had been obstinate and the situation had become more and more impossible. In the end, he had felt it necessary to tell the Prime Minister and to send in his resignation. The Prime Minister has pleaded with him to withdraw the resignation. In response to the very strong pleas by the Prime Minister and out of great respect for Mr. Nehru, the General had agreed to withdraw his resignation. The General told me that after the news of his intended resignation was published, he had received all sorts of messages of support. The armed forces were unitedly with him, and so were innumerable politicians. Some of Mr. Menon's own colleagues in the cabinet had privately expressed their support for the general. You see, the fact that a serving chief of the army staff could go to the British High Commissioner and open his heart tells us some story. I don't know what that story is, I leave it to you. Will it happen in another country? I am not sure. Another democratic country at least, I am not sure. See, before I move on, I must also speak a word about General Kaul. General Kaul, he was in the good books of both Nehru and Krishnan. Kaul was, of course, he was a brilliant officer. There's no doubt about it. But his ambitions were sky high and he cleverly exploited his supposed closeness with Jawaharlal Nehru. In fact, he was an Army Service Corps ASC officer. And in Army, of course, it's a tribe, they don't... if you fast a Service Corps officer on infantry, naturally the infantry officers would resent. So Kaul was naturally resented by other officers because he had forayed into an area in which they thought he had no expertise. Okay. I am of the firm view that Nehru was totally wrong in promoting him. This created a rift in the army. It was not cohesive, but it created further confusion in the army, especially when the Chinese threat was looming. But as Timaya's episode shows, Krishnamen's very famous statement that there was too much whiskey flowing in the American embassy and the British High Commission was absolutely true. The American embassy and the British High Commission were refuges to all disgruntled Indian politicians and military men. That Timaya was one of them was unfortunate. Now, let us come to the Indian Army and what the Army wanted in 1958. In 58, Army placed a demand for modernization. The cost was more than 500 crores. 500 crores then was about 80% of the total budget of Government of India. The government rightly rejected Army's demand. Ill-informed persons accuse Nehru of neglecting the army, but they conveniently forget that in the early years, India had to scrounge for every rupee. India's first priority then was to prevent hunger and starvation. In 1963, after the Chinese debacle, Nehru said this in the parliament. This is a this you should listen to him very carefully. When we are faced with extreme difficulty, like the Chinese invasion, you have to undertake costly re-equipment and modernization, whatever happens. You can tax your people. You can seek the help of friendly countries. But imagine at peacetime, how far can you create this atmosphere? How heavily can you tax your people? How far will others help? This clearly sums up the dilemma of India. What Nehru wanted to convey was this: countries like India always had to make a choice between gun and bread. Most of the time, any democratic government which cares for the people would choose bread. But did Nehru neglect guns? Let us view some of the statistics. These statistics are very, very revealing. I don't think anyone has presented this before. As I said earlier, Akilek's limit was 200,000 army personnel. Though army was demobilized after independence, the persons sent out were defense battalion looking after internal security, and the pioneers were basically the laborers. In 1951, Indian Army had 3,25,000 personnel. In 1962, it increased to 5,50,000 personnel. What is also forgotten is that it was then not very easy to recruit officers for the army. In spite of all advertisements and all effort, the army had a shortage of about 3,000 officers in 1960. But what I am going to say now is very, very important. India was spending a huge portion of its income on the defense services right from 1947. This was the imperialist structure inherited by the democratic India, and it was quite difficult for India to dismantle this structure. You please hear me out. Let me give you some statistics. In 1948-49, India's budget was 257 crores. India's total expenditure and allocation, budget allocation was 257 crores. 121 crores was for the defense services. That is 47% of our expenditure was on defense. This is in 1948-49. In 49-50, this became 48.7%. In 50-51, it became almost 50%, 49.8%. So the Indian government had to take action. You can't spend 50% of the income on defense, on feeding our soldiers. This was what is happening. So when Nehru was saying that the expenditure should be reduced, this was the reason. We didn't have money. If you spend 50% on defense, that is on 200,000 soldiers, only 50% for other expenditure, you could see the plight of the Indian government. You see the statistics then. In 52-53, it is 48.5%. Then in 54-55, it is 49.2%. Then it became 43.8, 40.5. It came down to 25% in 62-63. That is the year of the Chinese war. Okay, 25% is still huge. Today we spend 10% of our budget for the defense services. Only 10% today. That's 2% of our GDP. That's what they say. But the 63-64 budget, the army was allocated 38% of the total budget. So the dilemma was that India had to cater to other needs of the Indian people. The entire income could not be, spent on defense, So the cannot that India neglected to spend money on defense is not based on facts. Am I clear? It was amazing that we are spending 50% of our budget allocation to the armed forces in the early years of independence. And still our leaders get the blame that they didn't spend enough money on defense. But China did not have this problem. China, on the other hand, was headed by a leader who was totally different from Nehru, Mao. If Nehru could be called confident in the sphere of diplomacy, but hesitant in the sphere of, in the military sphere. Mao was exactly the other way around, at least in the initial years. Yeah, his military victories were of course legendary. His 8th Route Army won a stunning victory against Chiang Kai-shek's forces in the Chinese Civil War, and their stand against the Japanese army was also heroic and legendary. And it was Mao who decided against advices of other leaders of Chinese Communist Party to enter the Korean War in October 1950 when North Korea was collapsing. The Chinese army again won an amazing victory against the vastly superior American forces. So the Chinese army, renamed the People's Liberation Army, had in fact been fighting almost continuously for 2 decades. They were veterans. The PLA, the army was veterans. Such being the case, what are the choices available to Nehru in the early days? Spending more money on defense was, as I said, is ruled out. India could not have spent more money on defense in the initial days. If you ask me, there are 3 choices India had. Number 1 is India could ally with the communist bloc, and India could ally with the imperialists, the US bloc, or India could function independently following the principle of non-alignment or not joining any of this group. See, India allying with the communist bloc would have created a huge problem for India, because it still had to depend on the colonial powers, particularly Britain, for everything. The entire Indian bureaucracy and the armed forces were British trained, and the majority of them were anti-communist. Also, joining the communist, there are several reasons. I will only give you the main reason. Also, joining the communist bloc was no guarantee that border disputes would be sorted out amicably. After all, Russia and China fell apart and fought a bitter border war in 1969. I think, it is 69. Okay. Allying with the West was also not a very practical option. There was a possibility of Russia and China joining together and treating India as an enemy. In any case, in the 50s, Europe was getting rebuilt and not much aid would have come India's way. In all probability, India would have become a battleground like Vietnam and Korea did, bringing untold misery to the Indian people. In any case, this is very, very important. In any case, India joining the Western countries would be an anti-democratic choice. We tend to forget that more than 80% of Indian voters consistently voted for socialist type of governments from 1952 onwards. The right-wing share of the votes was always less than 20% until the advent of the BJP government in the 90s of the last century. Thus, Nehru not joining any of these 2 camps was a very practical option. It must be said that he was respected in both Russia and in the USA and in the Western capitals. Okay. India was able to get immediate US assistance when Chinese attack came. I will speak about this later. Yeah. Now we will come to diplomacy. Even when the Chinese civil war was on, that was between the Kuomintang China and the Mao's forces, which ended in the victory of Mao in 1949. India was acutely aware of the possibility of China occupying Tibet. K.M. Panikkar, the Chinese India's ambassador to China, explicitly said that China's control over Tibet would mean the immediate revival of claims against Nepal, Bhutan and Sikkim, and also the denunciation of the McMahon line. This is what K.M. Panikkar said even before Mao Zedong came to power. When China started its military operations in Tibet, in a famous letter to Nehru, Vallabhbhai Patel said, this is being quoted by the right wing guys, again and again and again. So I don't talk about this. He said, Vallabhbhai Patel said that Chinese control over Tibet threw into the melting pot all frontier and commercial settlements. Okay, among other things, he warned of a weakly held northeastern frontier with unlimited scope for infiltration. Mark the words, unlimited scope for infiltration. He also added that the people inhabiting these portions have no established loyalty to India. They are not free from pro-Mongoloid prejudices. This is what Patel says. They were not free from pro-Mongoloid prejudices. Patel suggested a range of issues to be considered, including redeployment of the army to protect the likely areas of dispute, India's defense requirements, administrative steps to strengthen the frontier provinces, and policy regarding the McMahon line. But Patel did not suggest that India should militarily intervene in Tibet. He was too much of a realist to make such a suggestion. Nehru elaborated his ideas in an important note. He considered that neither India nor any other external power could prevent the Chinese takeover of Tibet. However, he discounted the possibility of an invasion of China as exceedingly unlikely. For any such invasion would undoubtedly lead to a world war. This is what Jawaharlal Nehru thought at that time. At the same time, this is what Nehru said, this Nehru's words. At the same time, there were certainly chances of gradual infiltration across our border and possibly of entering and taking possession of disputed territory if there is no obstruction to this happening. India had to prepare to counter the infiltration of men and ideas. In the ultimate analysis, wrote Nehru, the real protection we should seek is some kind of understanding with China. Nehru was very, very clearly aware of the disparity between the two countries. India would strive for peaceful relationship while simultaneously taking the necessary steps to safeguard its fundamental interest, which is the preservation of its frontiers. This, of course, entailed taking measures to prevent gradual occupation of territory rather than preparing to meet an invasion. The assumption that infiltration would be the modus operandi of the Chinese. This was what, in fact, as I said, this was what even Sardar Patel felt. There will be infiltration. Sardar Patel didn't talk about invasion. He also felt there will be infiltration. So the assumption that infiltration would be the modus operandi of the Chinese gained currency because the peoples of India's frontier regions had ethnic, religious and cultural ties with Tibet and had remained outside the pale of administration during the British Raj. In fact, every leader at that time thought that the citizens of the people of northeastern India would not be that loyal to India. This was the lurking suspicion in the minds of our leaders, including Sardar Patel. So what Nehru did was, the economic and political advantage of being with India would have to brought home to them. This was what Nehru thought. To examine these issues, the Nehru formed a committee under the Deputy Defence Minister Himmat Singh Ji. At that time, he was a Deputy Defence Minister. A committee was formed. The Himmat Singh Ji committee submitted the report in two parts in April and September, I think, 1951. And on his recommendation, the government sought to extend administrative cover into the remote tribal areas of Nepha, that is the present-day Arunachal Pradesh, and to introduce economic and welfare measures. A road building program was initiated and checkposts established close to the frontier. All these things were done gradually, step by step. In 1954, India entered into an agreement with China on the Tibet issue. Many feel, even I too think, that India should have raised the border issue, since at that time China definitely needed the support of India. There was a chance that the issue would have been settled amicably. I may be wrong. I am not saying that. That's my personal view. I may be wrong. There are several reasons why this was not done, and I am going to explain those reasons. After explaining those reasons, I will stop. Then the Chu Enlai Nehru diplomatic negotiations I will start in my next lecture. See, Panikkar was a great historian who understood China. Thought so long as China was unwilling to rake up the matter, India should use the time to make its position effective in the frontier areas where its administrative hold was weak and its political position tenuous. This was the view of Sardar Patel. This was the view of Jawaharlal Nehru. This was the view of K.M. Panikkar. Okay, this is history. This is not WhatsApp history. This is real history. In fact, Delhi had received reports from its mission in Lhasa. India had a consulate at that time at Lhasa, suggesting that the Chinese were indulging in a whispering campaign to the effect that after Tibet, Sikkim, Bhutan and areas south of the McMahon line would be liberated. Nehru himself thought that India had to be on guard for some kind of gradual spreading out or infiltration. Also, although various steps were initiated in accordance with the Immersing Ji report, there was not much progress in the Nifa area. In these circumstances, it's not surprising that Nehru sought to avoid pushing the boundary issue, the boundary question to the fore. India, again I will repeat, India was far from consolidating its influence in the border regions and totally ill prepared to counter any efforts by Chinese to take possession of these parts. If the issue became an openly contested one, India might be unable to defend its claims. In plain terms, had there been a war, India would have lost heavily. So the crucial decision in retrospect lay in the Ladakh sector, in fact. Here, Delhi decided to rely neither on the ambitious Ladakh line or the McDonald line, but a compromise line which had some plausibility. This line placed Aksai Chin within India's territory. The Foreign Secretary at that time, R.K. Nehru, later recalled that in 1953, our experts had advised us that our claim to Aksai Chin was not too strong. The Prime Minister was agreeable to adjustments in Aksai Chin and one or two other places being made as part of a satisfactory overall settlement. So, in the eastern side also India was not very sure, and India was not very sure on the western side either. So, Nehru instructed the Indian delegation not to raise the boundary questions during the negotiations over Tibet. If the Chinese raise it, Nehru said, if the Chinese raise it, we should express our surprise and point out that this is a settled issue. He publicly stated that our people have gone there not to discuss the frontier problem. It is not an issue at all to be discussed. The agreement on Tibet was signed on 29th April 1954. India gave up its rights in Tibet and recognized it as a region of China. As R.K. Nehru explained, these were a concession only to realism. India could not have done anything else. India was keen to include the Panchsheel principle in the agreement, the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence in the text of the treaty. Okay. So Nehru thought that this would lay the foundation for peaceful Sino-Indian relationship. But Nehru was not naive. Nehru said this. In the final analysis, he said, no country has any deep faith in the policies of another country. I will repeat. In the final analysis, no country has any deep faith in the policies of another country, more especially in regard to a country which tends to expand. But whatever its adjust might be, that is the expanding countries adjust might be, we can by our policy strengthen our own position and even curb to some extent undesirable urges in other country. Thus, Nehru had no illusions at all about China. He wanted to curb its undesirable urges as long as possible. See, the thing is, defense ministry at that time was not a very great ministry. Nobody wanted to become a defense minister of India at that time. Okay. That was why people like, Kadju and Gopal Samayangar, they were there in the Ministry of Defense. Okay. See, the main issue is India was not in a position to spend big money on defense. Yeah, defense was not a much sought after portfolio at that time. And Nehru really wanted to have a dynamic person to be in the ministry. Okay, he thought Timmy was also known to him. Krishnan, of course, was a friend. He thought both of them will gel, but that didn't happen. That didn't happen. Everyone knew that China will come right up to India's border. But India was not able to do anything. India didn't have anything at that time. The Indian army was not prepared to fight. And India didn't have anything. In 1950, India didn't have anything. So the best option available to India was to improve its relationship with China, which was what India did. In fact, it was because of that the war was, was postponed to 1962. China was not totally wrong. China was wrong is only the Tibetan guys say. India didn't say China was wrong. Okay, no country in the world said China was wrong. Even today, no country says that. Tibet is an independent country only in your mind. It's not an independent country. The main point is, let us say that Tibet is right. Let us say that Tibet is right to gain independence. Would it have been in India's interest to promote Tibet's independence at the initial days of our existence? Okay, all our leaders thought it was not right. Sardar Patel didn't think so. Jawaharlal Nehru didn't think so, and all other leaders also didn't think so. These are all kite flying, and people who do not know history, people who read history in bits and pieces, only they say such things. I am talking from India's interest. See, no Western country accepted Tibet's independence. In 1914 also it was not accepted. Later also it was not accepted. Okay. The difference is between suzerainty and sovereignty. Okay. Many countries said that China had suzerainty over Tibet but not sovereignty. Okay. That was what, as per the 1914 agreement. But the Chinese government did not ratify the 1914 agreement. So we are back to square one. Dalai Lama himself doesn't say that Tibet is an independent country. Okay, the Dalai Lama today, he doesn't say that Tibet is an independent country. He wants more powers to the Tibetan people, that's all.